In Regency
Gentlemen,
England,
I bring news
madness
from
was
the
not
council.
measured in symptoms.
We are listening.
It was
Proceed.
measured in
The
whispers.
edict is here,
A diagnosis required
The
no
moonlight
physician,
pales
no
beside
clinical
you, my love.
examination,
and your
no
words
evidence
warm my
beyond the
heart.
careful
Forever
arrangement
then.
of syllables in a drawing room. A pause before speaking a name, a knowing glance exchanged across a card table. The particular quality of silence that followed, certain invitations, certain appearances, certain unfortunate associations that could not be openly acknowledged but must be universally understood. The Duke of Blackthorn is mad. Everyone said so. No one could prove it. But in the arithmetic of reputation, proof had never been the point. The point was the whisper. The point was the exile. The point was the way an entire existence, everything a man might be, his intelligence, his character, his carefully constructed inner world could collapse into a single word and remain there fossilized beyond appeal or correction. Mad. And into this particular arrangement of social cruelty stepped 18-year-old Serafina Ashford, who had committed crimes of her own. She had read books, not the approved variety, not the gentle accomplishments of watercolor technique, and improving verse designed to make a young woman decorative without making her dangerous. She had read philosophy, political economy, natural sciences borrowed from her father's library in the years before he thought to lock the door. She had read Wollstonecraft and Locke and Adam Smith, and the problem was not that she had read them, but that she had understood them. Understanding, it turned out, was the unforgivable part. She had argued, not the performance of disagreement permitted to clever women in certain progressive drawing rooms, conducted for the amusement of men who wished to appear enlightened. She had engaged in actual argument, pursued to logical conclusion, regardless of whether the conclusion made anyone comfortable. At 17, she had corrected a visiting clergyman's theological reasoning at dinner and watched the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees in as many seconds. She had not apologized. Her mother had wept. Her elder brother Arthur had declared her constitutionally perverse. Her aunt had suggested not for the first time that young women of excessive intelligence were incapable of happiness and ought to resign themselves to spinsterhood as early as possible before they developed unrealistic expectations. Serafina had listened with the composed expression she had perfected since childhood and understood with absolute clarity that her family was not wrong about her prospects. By every measure, the marriage market recognized she was unsaleable goods. Too opinionated, too educated, too entirely herself in a world that required women to be anyone but. The season had confirmed it. 3 months of carefully orchestrated mortification. Dancing partners who fulfilled their obligation with visible reluctance. Conversations that died the moment she contributed anything of substance. The particular humiliation of watching younger, prettier, more agreeable girls receive offers while she collected polite rejections. By October, her mother had stopped accompanying her to assemblies. By November, the invitations had thinned to nothing. By December, the family had convened what her brother called a council, but what Serafina understood to be a tribunal. Something must be done, her mother had said, twisting her handkerchief with the desperate energy of a woman watching her social standing crumble. She cannot remain here indefinitely. People are beginning to talk. Let them talk, Serafina had replied, which had been, even by her standards, spectacularly unhelpful. The offer from Blackthorn had arrived 3 days later. Her father had read it twice, set it down, picked it up again, as though the words might have rearranged themselves in the interim. The Duke of Blackthorn, he had said slowly, has made an offer. For Serafina. The silence that followed had been comprehensive. The Mad Duke, her mother had whispered. Is there another Duke of Blackthorn? Arthur had asked, with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoyed other people's difficulties. Her father had continued reading. The settlement is generous, extraordinarily so. The terms are straightforward. He proposes marriage within the month. This is absurd, her mother had said. We cannot possibly. Can we not? Her father had looked up. Serafina is 18. She has refused or been refused by every suitable man in 3 counties. Her reputation for peculiarity is now sufficiently established that no respectable family will consider her. The Duke of Blackthorn, whatever his circumstances, is a duke. The settlement would secure her future and remove a considerable burden from this household. He is mad, her mother had repeated. He is a duke, her father had said, and Serafina is unmarriageable. I fail to see that we have the luxury of scruples. Serafina had sat very still and understood that the decision had already been made. Not in this room, not in this conversation, but months ago, years ago, perhaps in every argument she had won, and every expectation she had refused to meet. She had constructed her own exile with perfect efficiency. What does Serafina think? Arthur had asked, not because he cared, but because he enjoyed the aesthetics of cruelty. They had all turned to look at her. She had met her father's gaze and seen there not malice but exhaustion, the tired pragmatism of a man with limited resources and a daughter who had made herself impossible to place. She had looked at her mother and seen fear, not for Serafina's happiness, but for the family's standing, for what it meant to have an unmarried daughter approaching 20. She had looked at Arthur and seen nothing worth considering. I think she had said with perfect composure that a duke is a duke, and I am, as you have all taken pains to establish, in no position to refuse. The announcement had been made the following week, the wedding date set for January. Serafina had spent the intervening weeks constructing a portrait of her future from fragments of rumor and second-hand account, and the portrait was not encouraging. Blackthorn Manor was sealed against visitors. The Duke had not appeared in society for 3 years. There were stories of Valsian episodes of servants dismissed for gossiping of a household run with military discipline to manage what could not be cured. No one knew the details. Everyone knew the conclusion. The Duke of Blackthorn was dangerous, unstable, mad. Serafina had arranged her expectations accordingly. She had set them as low as human calculation permitted and fixed them there. If one anticipated nothing, disappointment became structurally impossible. It was a philosophy that had served her well in the past. She saw no reason to abandon it now. The church was cold. It was the first thing she noticed on the morning of her wedding, not the sparse gathering of witnesses arranged in the pews like an afterthought, not the gray January light pressing through narrow windows, not the curious expressions of the few souls who had come to observe what polite society had privately declared the most bewildering match of the season. It was the cold, bone-deep, unapologetic settling into the stones of St. Margaret's, as though it had always lived there and intended to remain long after every human drama conducted within its walls had been forgotten. Serafina found this appropriate. She had not expected warmth. She stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that had been her mother's, altered hastily and imperfectly. The seams strained slightly at the shoulders in a manner that would have mortified a bride with more to lose. She kept her spine straight, her hands still, her expression neutral with the discipline of a woman who had learned that feeling. Things visibly was a luxury one could not always afford. She was 18 years old. She was entirely unmarriageable. And she was about to wed a man everyone called crazy. The church door opened behind her. The small gathering shifted with a collective intake of breath, and Serafina understood before she turned that the Duke had arrived and that he had produced simply by entering a room exactly the effect his reputation prepared one for. She turned. He was tall. That was the first fact. Tall and dark and dressed with an exactness that suggested either considerable care or an exceptionally capable valet. His coat was deep charcoal, his cravat tied with precise correctness. Every detail of his appearance arranged with meticulous order that spoke not of vanity, but of control. He was, she estimated, perhaps 32, though something in the quality of his stillness made age difficult to determine. He walked up the aisle of St. Margaret's with even unhurried steps, and she watched him approach, and found herself revising every assumption she had made. He did not look mad. He looked, if anything, extraordinarily steady. Dark eyes swept the interior of the church with calm, assessing intelligence that catalogued and dismissed and settled finally on Serafina herself with attention so unwavering and unperformed that she felt absurdly as though she were the one being evaluated. He reached the altar. He inclined his head with precise correctness, not warmth, not coldness, but the deliberate neutrality of a man who had decided in advance what each gesture would and would not communicate. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was low and even measured, as everything about him was measured. She had expected something. She was not certain what precisely. Erratic energy, perhaps. The visible signs of an unstable mind. Instead, she received the disquieting impression of a man who had gathered every aspect of his external presentation into meticulous order and maintained it there through continuous effort. This unsettled her more than wildness would have. Wildness she could have met with braced endurance, but this steadiness, this dark, watchful control she had not prepared for in the absence of preparation, left her at a disadvantage she did not appreciate. "Your Grace," she replied, gratified to find her own voice equally level. The ceremony was brief. The clergyman conducted it with the slightly rushed air of a man who had been given to understand that efficiency was preferred. The Duke spoke his responses with quiet clarity. Every word correct, every pause measured, nothing performed and nothing withheld. Serafina spoke hers with equal precision and fixed her gaze on the middle distance and told herself that composure was entirely possible, that she was above all things a practical woman. She was less convincing on the latter point than she would have wished. When it was concluded, the Duke offered his arm with the same deliberate correctness he had maintained throughout. She took it. They walked from the church into the gray January morning as the sparse gathering watched them go, with expressions ranging from pity to fascination. Serafina did not look back. The journey to Blackthorn Manor consumed the better part of 3 hours conducted in a well-appointed carriage across increasingly rural roads as the afternoon light failed and the countryside grew wilder. The Duke sat opposite her and looked out the window in silence. Serafina sat and looked at him and tried to reconcile the evidence before her with the portrait she had constructed. He had not spoken since the church. He did not appear agitated by the silence. He appeared, if anything, to find it preferable. She did not attempt conversation. She was not yet certain what conversation was available to them, and she had a strong instinct against speaking simply to fill emptiness. Blackthorn Manor emerged from the failing light as a large, severe structure of dark stone, windows lit from within, grounds extending into shadow on either side. It was not welcoming. It was, however, undeniably substantial, and as they passed through the gates, Serafina adjusted her assessment with pragmatic thoroughness. Whatever awaited her within, she would meet it as she had met everything else, with clear eyes and an entirely undecorated understanding of what was actually before her. She was shown to chambers of considerable size and unexpected order. A maid attended her with quiet competence. She changed into the gray silk she had brought for the evening and sat before the fire, with her hands folded and her mind working, and her deliberately lowered expectations held precisely in place. An hour passed, then a knock at the door. "Your Grace," the maid said, addressing the corridor. "Her Grace is in the sitting room as requested." The Duke entered and dismissed the maid with a brief word and closed the door with care. He was still measured in his movements. He was, it seemed, always measured. He crossed to the chair opposite hers, not the chair beside her, not a position suggesting proximity, and sat with deliberate motion and regarded her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. Then he said, "I owe you an honest account of yourself and your situation." He paused. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I shall require some adjustment to the title." "As shall I," Serafina said. Something crossed his face. Brief, almost imperceptible. She thought it might have been acknowledgement. "I will be direct," he said. "I am told it is not always a comfortable quality. I have found, however, that it is the only one I can consistently maintain." "I have been told the same," Serafina said, "about myself, in rather less neutral terms." He studied her. "Then we may understand one another. What I am about to tell you is the truth of my situation. All of it, without the modifications society employs to make difficult things easier to hear. You deserve the actual truth, and I find I have no interest in offering anything else." Serafina said nothing. She waited. "I am not mad," the Duke said. The fire crackled between them. Outside the windows, the wind had risen. "I suffer from a neurological condition," he continued in the same even methodical tone. "Its episodes produce tremor, temporary paralysis of the limbs, in periods of sensory overwhelm in which sound and light become genuinely unbearable. They are unpredictable in their timing. They are not dangerous except insofar as loss of physical control is inherently undignified and occasionally results in injury through falling." He paused. "They are, however, entirely beyond what the medical establishment currently possesses the vocabulary to categorize. And what the medical establishment cannot categorize, society invariably labels lunacy." Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you allowed them to?" "Yes, deliberately." His eyes did not waver. "Isolation is considerably simpler to maintain when people believe it one dangerous rather than merely inconvenient. A dangerous man is avoided. An inconvenient one is managed, advised, supervised, subjected to persistent, well-meaning interference. I have found the former preferable." Serafina considered this. It was, she acknowledged privately, not entirely unreasonable. In the violent episodes the rumors describe, exaggeration built upon exaggeration. Constructed from a single incident 7 years ago, in which I experienced an episode in a public setting, and several witnesses provided accounts shaped more by alarm than observable fact. I did not help matters by refusing to offer correction. Silence in such circumstances functions as confirmation. "So why tell me now?" He was still for a moment. The fire moved behind him. "Because you are my wife," he said, "and because you have been delivered to this house on the basis of information that is almost entirely false. And because whatever this arrangement is, whatever it may become, I will not have it built on a foundation of convenient fiction." Serafina looked at him steadily. Why did you accept the offer? Specifically. There is, I understand, a shortage of families willing to negotiate with you. You might have had your choice among those who were. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth precisely, but adjacent to it. Your family's account of you was thorough, he said. Remarkably so, too educated, too opinionated, too entirely unwilling to perform the decorative helplessness her situation required. The faintest pause. I required a wife of genuine intelligence, one who would not flinch from truth, who could not be managed by appeals to convention, who possessed sufficient quality of mind to hear an honest account of a difficult situation and respond to it rationally rather than theatrically. Your family's assessment of you as damaged goods was, in my estimation, the highest possible recommendation. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people recalibrating. Serafina looked at the man across from her. This steady, controlled, solitary man who had chosen her specifically because every quality that made her unwanted elsewhere had in his particular calculus made her exactly what he needed. She understood that she had arrived at Blackthorn Manor prepared for one kind of life and found in its place something she did not yet have adequate language to describe. She did not know whether to be relieved. The revelation removed the threat she had steeled herself against and replaced it with a reality far more nuanced. She did not know whether to be insulted. She had been selected with the logic one applied to a practical problem. His appreciation of her qualities, genuine as it seemed, had originated in utility. She did not know whether to be fascinated, and yet she was. Undeniably, uncomfortably, she was. She settled after rigorous internal accounting on all three. I see, she said at last. I expect, the Duke replied with that same precise evenness, that you have questions. Several hundred, Serafina said. I shall endeavor to begin with the most pressing. And for the first time since she had met him at the altar, in the carriage across this measured room, she thought she saw at the very edges of his controlled and guarded expression the shadow of something that might in different circumstances and with considerably more time become a smile. Ask them, Lucian Blackthorn said. I will answer everyone. 3 months into her marriage, Serafina Blackthorn, a title she was still occasionally surprised to find, attached to her person, had developed the habit of rising before the household and walking the east wing of the manor in the gray early hours before breakfast. It was, she had discovered, the finest hour Blackthorn offered. The corridors were empty. The light came through tall windows in long, pale sheets. The whole vast house belonged temporarily to no one in particular. She could think without interruption. She could exist without performance. She could be precisely herself in a way that had never been possible in her mother's drawing room or at any assembly she had ever attended. The house itself was not what she had expected, which was becoming a pattern. She had anticipated neglect, the visible entropy of a household abandoned to isolation and indifference. What she found instead was order of a very specific and deliberate kind. The rooms were clean and well-maintained. The staff was small but quietly competent. The whole establishment operated on rhythms so precisely established that the house ran with the efficiency of a well-regulated clock. She had understood within a fortnight that the rhythms were designed. Every aspect of daily life at Blackthorn had been arranged to minimize unpredictability. Sound, disruption, the sudden jarring intrusions that could precipitate the Duke's episodes. She had adapted to these rhythms without difficulty. She had always been beneath the sharp edges that made her inconvenient in drawing rooms, a fundamentally orderly person. The difficulty was not the order. The difficulty was the space between the order. The long, quiet afternoons in her sitting room with her books and her thoughts and the particular quality of silence that was not peaceful but simply empty. She had her own chambers, her own schedule. More genuine freedom than she had possessed in her entire previous life. Her mother's household had operated on the principle that a young woman's movements required constant supervision. Here no one supervised her, no one corrected her, no one for considerable stretches of time spoke to her at all. She was technically content. She was also, if she applied the rigorous honesty she applied to everything else, genuinely lonely. She had not expected to notice the Duke's absence when he was not present. She had not expected to find his presence on the occasions when it occurred the most interesting thing available to her. She had expected indifference in both directions, the civil distance of two people sharing a house by legal obligation. Indifference had not materialized. In its place had grown something considerably more complicated and considerably more difficult to categorize. It had begun with the books. 3 weeks into their marriage, she had returned to her sitting room and after breakfast to find a volume placed on her writing table. a work of natural philosophy she had not previously encountered, its cover worn with genuine use. A small folded note tucked inside the front page. The handwriting was precise and economical. It read, "I observed your interest in the natural history text in the library. This may be of further use to you." She had read the book in 2 days. She had left it on the breakfast table with a note of her own. The argument in the third chapter requires more rigorous evidential support than the author provides. The conclusion is correct, but arrives there by insufficient means. The book had disappeared. 2 days later, a second volume appeared in its place. This one accompanied by a note that read, "You may find the author's earlier work addresses the evidential gap. The conclusion, as you observe, is sound. The methodology is the difficulty, with a great deal of natural philosophy." This had been, Serafina recognized in retrospect, the beginning. The notes accumulated. They began in the register of useful information. Recommended texts, observations on shared reading, the occasional dry correction of a point she had made too broadly, and shifted by imperceptible degrees into something warmer and more personal. He had a dry wit that did not translate to formal spoken conversation, but emerged on the page with considerable precision. She had begun to look forward to the notes with an eagerness she considered somewhat undignified and was entirely unable to suppress. Their in-person interactions remained by contrast deliberately correct. They met at dinner with the regularity of established routine. Conversation was conducted with propriety and increasing genuineness. He asked about her reading and listened to her answers with genuine attention. She asked about estate management and received replies of real substance, offered without the condescension she had learned to expect from men discussing practical matters with women. He did not simplify. He did not redirect her toward more suitable topics. He answered what she asked, and occasionally toward the end of the meal, the conversation acquired momentum that carried it past the merely correct into something approaching real exchange. But he was always restrained, always measured. The wall was always present, not hostile, not cold, but deliberate. A maintained distance that she had begun to suspect cost him something, though she could not yet determine what. By the end of February, the notes had evolved into extended dialogues. The nature of political obligation, the epistemological foundations of natural science, the proper limits of individual liberty in an ordered society. He argued with precision and genuine conviction. She argued back with equal precision and no conviction whatever that the force of his title excused him from the requirement of logical consistency. He found this, she gathered, from the slight but perceptible increase in engagement his notes took on during disagreement, rather more invigorating than he had perhaps anticipated. She found it, if she was honest, the most genuine intellectual companionship she had encountered in her life. It was also during February that she discovered his other skill, the one he had not mentioned on their wedding night. The estate steward, Mr. Pembroke, had presented a dispute regarding tenant boundaries. Two farmers, both long-standing, both claiming the same strip of land based on different interpretations of lease language written 40 years prior. The Duke had asked Serafina to examine the leases. She had looked up from her breakfast. "I am not a solicitor." "No," he had agreed, "but you read Latin, and you have a facility for legal reasoning that most solicitors lack. I would value your assessment." She had taken the documents to her sitting room. She had spent 3 days with them. The language was archaic and deliberately obscure in the manner of all legal documents designed to provide maximum employment for lawyers. But the logic once excavated was clear. She had written her analysis. Not a brief summary, but a full argument structured as she had learned from reading her father's law books in the years before he had thought to restrict her access. The Duke had read it at dinner. He had set it down. He had looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man encountering something unexpected and valuable. "This is excellent," he had said, "better than anything Pembroke could have produced, better than most solicitors I have employed." "The law is logic," Serafina had replied. "I am adequate at logic." "You are considerably more than adequate." He had paused. "Would you be willing to review other estate matters? I find I would trust your judgment." She had agreed, and with that agreement the nature of her days had changed. She was no longer simply a wife installed in comfortable rooms with nothing to occupy her mind. She was a partner, not in name only but in actual function. The Duke brought her legal questions, boundary disputes, contract interpretations, the enforcement of lease terms that had been written when her grandfather was young. She brought him answers, researched, documented, argued with the precision she had been told her entire life was unbecoming in a woman, and which he treated as though it were the most valuable commodity she possessed. By March, she was effectively managing the legal affairs of the estate. By the end of March, neighboring landowners had begun making inquiries through Mr. Pembroke about whether the Duchess might be willing to review their documents as well. "You are developing a reputation," the Duke had said one evening. "For what?" she had asked. "Being useful. For being formidable." She had not known what to do with that, so she had said nothing and returned to the boundary dispute she was resolving and tried not to notice the particular quality of warmth in his voice when he said the word formidable. The library incident occurred on a Thursday afternoon in late February. She had gone in search of a volume on Roman legal theory she had been unable to locate in her sitting room. The Duke was already there, standing at the far window with a book open in his hands, his back partially toward her. He had not heard her enter. She paused in the doorway, struck by the unfamiliar image of him in an unguarded moment. The strict control slightly loosened, his posture less precisely maintained. Something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was in this unobserved instant, simply a man standing in a room he liked, reading a book he was interested in, without the continuous management of external presentation. She must have made some small sound because he turned. "Your Grace," he said, and the composure resettled itself immediately. "Forgive me, I had not expected you." "Nor I you. I shall not disturb you. I am only in search of the Justinian commentary. I believe it is in the second section. Third shelf from the top." He started to cross toward the shelves. And then it happened. There was no drama to it, no warning, no gradual onset. One moment he was moving with even directed steps, and the next his right hand raised to indicate the relevant shelf had begun to tremble with a fine, rapid movement entirely outside his control. The tremor moved up his arm. He stopped walking. His left hand came up and gripped the edge of the nearest shelf with white-knuckled intensity, as though anchoring himself. His eyes closed. Serafina did not move for half a second, not from alarm, but from the instinctive understanding that movement itself might constitute intrusion. Then she walked toward him with deliberate, quiet steps and stopped at a distance she judged near enough to be useful without being overwhelming. "What do you require?" she said. Her voice was level and practical. She did not ask if he was all right because she could observe that he was not all right, and the question would have been decorative rather than useful. His jaw was set. The tremor had spread to his shoulder. His eyes remained closed. "Silence," he said through teeth that were not quite clenched. "The light, the window." She crossed to the window without a word and drew the heavy curtain across it, reducing the gray February light to dim, manageable warmth. Then she returned to where she had been standing, and was silent, and stayed silent, and did not move, and did not speak, and did not perform any of the gestures of distress that would have required him to manage her reaction on top of managing his own person. The minutes passed, 5 perhaps, or 6. The tremor gradually subsided. His grip on the shelf loosened by degrees. His breathing, which had been deliberately controlled throughout, steadied further. When he opened his eyes, she was still standing where she had been standing, her hands folded, her expression attentive and entirely neutral. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not immediately interpret. It was not gratitude exactly, or not only that, it was something more complex, something that suggested he had expected a different response and was still quietly recalibrating. "Thank you," he said at last. "Do you require anything further?" "No." A pause. "I shall be quite well in a few minutes. These episodes resolve of their own course." Another pause. Shorter. "You did not panic." "I saw no utility in it," Serafina said. Something moved across his face again. That quality she was beginning to identify as the closest he came in unguarded moments to genuine warmth. "No," he said quietly. "I imagine you did not." He recovered fully within the quarter hour, as he had said he would. She found the Justinian commentary, second section. Third shelf from the top. Precisely as he had indicated. They sat for the remainder of the afternoon in the library in adjacent chairs and read in companionable silence. Neither of them remarked upon what had occurred, and both of them were, she thought, the better for the unremarkedness of it. That evening at dinner something had shifted. The conversation was still correct. They were always correct. But the deliberate distance felt slightly less like a wall and slightly more like a habit that was becoming, by degrees, unnecessary. He spoke more freely. She asked the questions she had been accumulating for weeks rather than selecting only the most safely impersonal. He told her about the estate, not the simplified account one offered to satisfy polite inquiry, but the actual complexity of it. The tenant disputes and drainage problems in the neighboring landowner whose boundary claims were both legally dubious and deeply tiresome. She told him the legal argument against the boundary claim was straightforward and outlined it precisely. He listened with the expression of a man being told something useful by a source he had not previously considered, and asked a follow-up question, and received a follow-up answer. By the end of the meal, they had been talking for 2 hours without either of them noting the passage of time. After that, the wall remained, but the windows in it multiplied. He began to stay longer after dinner. Their written exchanges grew from brief observations into extended dialogues that occasionally continued across 3 or 4 days on a single question. She began to see him more clearly. The dry wit she had detected on the page was present in spoken conversation too, once he relaxed sufficiently to allow it. A precise, understated humor that appeared without announcement and disappeared before it could be mistaken for performance. He had opinions on everything and offered them with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a great deal of time thinking and a rather smaller amount of time having those thoughts engaged with seriously. When she engaged with them, seriously agreed, disagreed, extended, challenged, he responded with an attention that was simply the attention of a very intelligent person who had been lonely for a very long time. This was the thing she had not expected, not the intelligence. She had inferred intelligence from his notes, but the loneliness. It was not declared. He would not have declared it, but it was present in the quality of his attention when she spoke. In the way the conversations after dinner had begun to extend and extend, as though neither of them was quite willing to be the one who ended them. In the notes that had started arriving twice a day instead of once. He was beneath the controlled exterior, profoundly alone. He had been alone for years. He had arranged his life for aloneness and defended it with considerable ingenuity, and had believed she suspected that he had made his peace with it. She understood this. She had made her own arrangements with loneliness. She had told herself for years that she preferred solitude to the performance required for company, and this had been true enough for long enough that she had stopped examining it. She was examining it now. In the evenings after dinner, when she returned to her sitting room and sat by the fire and thought over the conversation, just concluded, she found herself engaged in a new and slightly alarming habit of thought. She would replay a particular exchange, a moment in which he had said something that surprised her. The expression on his face during the library episode when he had looked at her with that unreadable quality that she was beginning slowly to read. She would examine these moments with the same rigorous attention she applied to textual arguments and find them invariably more interesting on second examination than on first. She was aware that this was not a safe direction of thought. She was also aware that she had entirely lost the capacity to think of Blackthorn Manor as a sentence. It had happened without announcement and without her permission. She could not have identified the precise moment, but somewhere between the first book left on her writing table and the long February afternoon in the library and the dinners that extended into late evening with neither of them willing to observe the hours, somewhere in the accumulated texture of 3 months of deliberate, genuine, increasingly essential daily life, the manor had become simply where she lived, where she was in the ways that mattered herself. April arrived with pale, tentative warmth, and the grounds of Blackthorn emerging from winter into something approaching hope. Serafina stood at the window of her sitting room on a Tuesday morning and looked out at gardens beginning to recover, and acknowledged with the full rigor she applied to every other question she had ever examined that she was in love with Lucian Blackthorn. Not from obligation, not from the softening of proximity, not from gratitude for his reasonable treatment of her. She loved him specifically and inconveniently. The dry wit and the formidable intelligence and the deep, meticulously defended loneliness of him. The way he argued and the way he listened and the way he had looked at her in the library. With that expression, she had spent 4 months learning to read and now read with a clarity that was its own difficulty. She looked at the gardens and she knew it completely, and she said nothing whatsoever, because she was a practical woman and the knowing of a thing and the saying of it were entirely separate decisions. At breakfast that morning, he had looked up from his correspondence and met her gaze and said, "The drainage reports from the North Field are more optimistic than last quarter." And she had said, "That is encouraging." And they had continued their breakfast in their customary comfortable silence, and nothing changed, and everything had changed, and she was not yet certain what to do about the difference. The spring progressed. Their exchanges deepened. The partnership that had begun with legal documents had expanded to include everything: estate management, tenant relations, investment decisions. He consulted her on matters that most men would not have mentioned to their wives. She provided analysis that most women were not expected to possess the capacity to deliver. The notes continued, but they had shifted again. Less about books now, more about themselves. Small confidences offered in measured increments. He had told her in a note written one early April evening that the estate had been his primary purpose for years, and that he had recently found himself questioning whether purpose constructed in isolation retained its meaning indefinitely. She had told him in reply that she had spent her entire previous life being told who she was by people with no genuine interest in the question, and that she had not known until Blackthorn what it felt like to be known accurately. He had not replied to that note immediately. When he did, the response was brief. I find I am glad you are here. It was the most direct personal statement he had yet committed to paper. She had read it 6 times and then placed it in the drawer of her writing table, where she kept the notes she did not throw away, which was all of them. In person, the restraint cost them both visibly, though neither acknowledged this. The dinners that extended into late evening, the conversations that had to be ended by one of them exercising conscious decision, these had acquired a quality of tension beneath the warmth that was not uncomfortable precisely, but was impossible to ignore. She was aware of him in a way she had not been before, or perhaps had been before and could now no longer attribute to anything other than what it was. He was, she thought, equally aware. But the wall remained. The windows had multiplied and the light came through them freely, but the wall remained, and she had begun to understand that it was maintained not by coldness but by something more complicated, something she did not yet have sufficient information to fully comprehend. The physician arrived on a Wednesday in early June. She did not know initially that he was a physician. He was announced as Dr. Pemberton, come from London on a professional visit. The Duke received this information at luncheon with an expression that did not change and a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Tighter, more deliberate, the steadiness of a man suppressing a response rather than simply existing in one. Serafina noted this and filed it and said nothing. Dr. Pemberton was installed in one of the guest rooms. He met with the Duke privately that afternoon. Serafina spent the afternoon in the library with a book she read, approximately none of her attention occupied, instead by the low murmur of voices from the study down the corridor and the quality of the Duke's expression at luncheon. She arrived at the answer by early evening when she went to return a book to the study and found on the desk in the disorder left by a hastily concluded meeting a letter bearing a solicitor's seal that had been inadequately tucked beneath a ledger. She did not read it fully. She read enough. The Duke's name, the phrase mental competency assessment, the names of 2 relatives she had heard mentioned once in passing as the Duke's nearest surviving family, Gerald Whitmore and his brother Thomas, and the date, 6 weeks prior. 6 weeks prior. She set the book down on the desk. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went to find her husband. He was in the East Garden, which was where he walked in the evenings when the light was failing and the grounds were quiet. She found him on the far path and fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a moment. She was arranging her words with precision. And because she was considerably more angry than she wished to appear before she had said what she intended to say. Dr. Pemberton, she said at last, is not here for a professional consultation. The Duke did not stop walking. No, he said, he was sent by your relatives. Cousins, I believe, on your father's side. They have engaged a solicitor and are pursuing a formal assessment of your mental competency. If the assessment supports their case, they may petition for legal incapacitation, which would transfer control of your estates, your title, and effectively your person to their management. She paused. I found the letter from 6 weeks ago. I see. His voice was even. It was always even. You knew, she asked. Yes. You have known for 6 weeks at minimum, possibly longer. Since January, he said, I became aware of their intentions in January. Serafina stopped walking. He stopped also and turned to face her. His expression was steady and restrained. She looked at it and felt the anger settle into something colder and more precise. You have known since January, she said, that there existed a direct and serious legal threat to your liberty and your estate, and you did not tell me. I did not wish to. If the next words Serafina said with a quietness that was considerably more forceful than volume would have been, is burden, I would ask you to reconsider it very carefully before it leaves your mouth. He was silent. I am your wife, she said. I am not a guest in this house whom you are obligated to keep comfortable. I am not a problem you have solved and set aside. I am your wife, and this threat concerns me directly. My situation, my security, my future. And you maintained it in deliberate concealment for 4 months while corresponding with me daily about political philosophy and estate drainage and everything except the single most significant material fact of our shared circumstances. Her voice remained entirely level. This was, she knew, more frightening than anger would have been. Why? He held her gaze. The steadiness was still present, but something beneath it was under considerable strain. I did not wish you to be troubled by difficulties that are mine to manage. Your difficulties, Serafina said, became mine the morning of our wedding. That is the nature of the institution we entered. I did not agree to a partial account of our situation. I agreed on the basis of the honest account you offered me on our wedding night to the full one. She paused. You told me on that night that you had no interest in anything built on convenient fiction, that you would offer me truth without modification. I have conducted myself on that basis for 6 months, and in 6 months you have been managing me. The word landed with precision because it was the accurate word, and they both knew it. Something in his expression broke. It was not dramatic. It was the subtle structural fracture of a control that had been maintained for a very long time under increasing and finally unsustainable pressure. He looked at her, and for a moment he was simply a man without the deliberate architecture of composure between himself and whatever it was he had been holding at deliberate distance for months. I did not tell you, he said, because I did not wish you to feel obligated to act, to involve yourself, to expend your considerable abilities on a difficulty that is mine by origin, and that I have no right to place at your feet. He was quiet for a moment. You came to this house without choice. You have made the best of circumstances you did not select. What you have built here, the life you have constructed within these walls is yours, and I will not have it complicated by the consequences of my situation any further than it already has been. Serafina looked at him. The anger had not dissolved. She would return to it, but it had made space for something else. For the understanding of what his answer actually meant, and what it revealed about the wall she had been looking at for 6 months without fully comprehending its foundations. You are protecting me, she said. I am attempting to. From your own life. He said nothing. Lucian. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. It arrived because no other word was sufficient for the directness of what she intended to say. And she watched him absorb the sound of it with an expression she recognized now, without difficulty. The expression of a man being reached specifically and precisely in a place he had not expected to be reached. Why? The silence stretched between them in the failing spring light. The garden was still around them. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was constructing its evening complaint with considerable persistence. Because I love you, he said. The words were quiet and entirely without decoration. Offered in the same direct register he brought to every truth he had ever told her. And they landed with exactly the weight of something that had been true for a very long time and was being said for the first time. I have loved you for months. Since February, I believe, though I suspect the honest answer is earlier, and February is simply the point at which I could no longer maintain a contrary argument with any intellectual credibility. He paused. And because I cannot offer you a life without difficulty, the condition does not resolve. The social consequences of this marriage do not diminish. And I do not consider it fair, I have never considered it fair to ask you to choose a life bound to mine with full knowledge of what that costs you when you had no choice in the original binding. Serafina was quiet for a moment. The bird continued its complaint. The light was almost gone. You have constructed, she said at last, an extremely thorough argument for why you should be permitted to make decisions on my behalf on the grounds that you love me and therefore know better than I do what I ought to want. He opened his mouth. I am not finished, she said. You told me 6 months ago that you required a wife who would not flinch from truth and could not be managed by appeals to convention. I have not flinched from a single truth this house has offered me. I have not been managed by anyone. I will not begin now simply because the person doing the managing believes his intentions are good. She met his eyes with complete steadiness. I am capable of choosing my own life, Lucian. I am capable of choosing it with full knowledge of its difficulties. That is, as I understand it, precisely why you wanted me. Something moved through his expression. The fracture widening, the composure relinquishing its long-held ground. You deserve better than I deserve, Serafina said firmly, to be consulted. That is all I am asking. Not a perfect life, not a life without difficulty, merely the basic dignity of being treated as an equal partner who is capable of bearing the truth of her own circumstances. She paused. Which is, I believe, what you promised me. He looked at her for a long moment, then very quietly, yes, it is. Then we will address this together, she said. The physician, the relatives, the solicitor, whatever legal proceedings they intend to bring, together, without management and without concealment. She paused. Are we agreed? We are agreed, he said. The garden was dark now, properly dark. The last of the spring lights surrendered to evening. They stood in it together, and the air between them held everything that had been said and a considerable amount that had not yet been said. And Serafina was aware that she had not told him, had not found the precise moment in the direct and necessary business of the confrontation to offer what his declaration had not arrived without answer. There would be time for that. There would be time for a great many things, if they managed what was coming. But what was coming was serious. Dr. Pemberton would deliver his assessment. The relatives would receive it. The legal machinery, once set in motion, would require force to stop. The kind of force that did not arrive without preparation and without the deliberate, methodical application of considerable intelligence. She reflected as they walked back toward the lit windows of the manor, quite a great deal of work to do. And in the morning she intended to begin. Serafina woke the next morning with the clarity that sometimes arrives after anger has burned through to its foundation and left behind only purpose. She had 7 days, perhaps less. Dr. Pemberton would complete his assessment. He would compile his observations into a report. That report would reach the Whitmore cousins and their solicitor, and once it did, the legal machinery would begin its inexorable progression toward a conclusion she had no intention of permitting. She rose before dawn, she dressed with precision, and she went to the study where Lucian kept his correspondence and his accounts and began to work. The first letter was to Dr. Edmund Ashworth of Bristol. She had encountered his name in her reading, a physician of progressive disposition whose published work on neurological conditions was the most comprehensive currently available in English medical literature. He had corresponded with continental specialists. He had treated patients with seizure disorders, paralysis, sensory disturbances. He had, most importantly, the professional standing to contradict an assessment built on observation rather than examination. She wrote with precision. She described Lucian's condition in full clinical detail: the tremors, the temporary paralysis, the sensory overwhelm, the complete absence of any effect on cognitive function or capacity to manage complex affairs. She asked for a written professional opinion. She sealed the letter and set it aside. The second letter was to Dr. Marcus Cavendish of London. His reputation was such that his disagreement with any assessment would require serious professional address. He was conservative in temperament, cautious in diagnosis, and utterly unimpeachable in his methodology. If Dr. Cavendish stated that a condition was neurological rather than psychiatric, no court in England would dismiss that opinion lightly. She wrote the same thorough description, the same clinical precision, the same request. The third letter was to Dr. William Harrington of Edinburgh. She had found his treatise on the distinction between mental incompetence and physical impairment in the library. It was the most rigorous work she had encountered on the subject. He had argued with considerable force that the law's conflation of the two represented a fundamental misunderstanding of human capacity and had resulted in unnecessary suffering. She wrote to him as she had written to the others, and added a final paragraph. I am writing not only as the Duke's wife, but as someone who has observed his management of a considerable estate for 6 months and found it without flaw. The suggestion that he lacks the capacity to manage his own affairs is not merely medically inaccurate. It is an offense against reason itself. She sealed all 3 letters. She sent them by express post. And then she turned to the second phase of her preparation. The estate records. She had been working with them for 3 months. She knew where everything was. The tenant ledgers, the investment accounts, the drainage projects, the boundary settlements, the correspondence regarding improvements and repairs, and the 1,000 small decisions that constituted competent management. She extracted 5 years of documentation. She organized it chronologically. She created summaries by category with a master document that drew the relevant conclusions in language a solicitor would find difficult to dispute without disputing mathematics itself. She worked through the day and into the evening. Lucian found her in the study at 9 o'clock, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. You should rest, he said. I should finish this, she replied without looking up. He was quiet for a moment, then, what are you doing building a case? Serafina. We agreed, and she said, and never looked up at him. We agreed to address this together. This is how I address things. With evidence, with preparation, with the methodical application of intelligence to problems that can be solved through logic. She paused. Unless you wish to retract that agreement. I do not wish to retract it. Then let me work. He studied her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the desk and sat in the chair opposite and said, Tell me what you need. They worked together until midnight. He provided details she had not known, dates and figures and the context behind decisions that looked questionable on paper but made perfect sense when understood fully. She incorporated everything into her documentation with the precision of someone constructing not merely an argument, but an edifice that could withstand assault from any direction. When she finally set down her pen, the case was nearly complete. She had the medical evidence pending. She had the estate documentation assembled. What she did not yet have was the legal framework. For that, she needed a solicitor. The next morning, she rode into the nearest market town and called upon Mr. Fielding. He was a quiet man of perhaps 50 with progressive views and genuine legal ability. She had corresponded with him regarding a tenant dispute in March. He had been impressed by her reasoning then. She was counting on that impression now. She outlined the situation without embellishment. The Whitmore cousins, the petition for incapacitation, the assessment based on rumor rather than fact, the need for a counter-argument that would stop the proceeding before it gained momentum. Mr. Fielding listened with deliberate attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You wish to argue this yourself." It was not a question. "I wish to have it argued correctly," Serafina said. "If you can do that, I am content to let you lead. But I will not have my husband's liberty placed in the hands of someone who does not understand what is actually at stake." "What is at stake, Your Grace?" "The principle," she said, "that a man's capacity should be judged by his actions rather than by the unfounded fears of those who stand to profit from his incapacitation." Mr. Fielding's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent. "I believe," he said slowly, "that your argument is sound, more than sound. It is the best articulation of that principle I have encountered, and I would be honored to assist you in presenting it." They worked for 3 hours. He provided the legal precedents, she provided the logical structure. Together they constructed an argument that was not merely defensible, but formidable. When she returned to Blackthorn that evening, the replies from the physicians had begun to arrive. Dr. Ashworth's opinion was unequivocal. The condition described is consistent with a neurological disorder affecting motor control and sensory processing. It bears no relationship to mental competence. Any assessment that conflates the two represents either profound ignorance of current medical understanding or deliberate misrepresentation. Dr. Cavendish's response was more measured but no less clear. "I have reviewed the symptoms described and find them entirely consistent with a neurological rather than psychiatric etiology. The patient's cognitive function, as evidenced by his management of complex affairs over an extended period, appears wholly intact. I cannot in good conscience support any conclusion of mental incompetence based on the information provided." Dr. Harrington's letter arrived last. It was the longest and the most forceful. He detailed the medical literature on similar conditions. He cited cases in which patients had been wrongly incapacitated based on physical symptoms misinterpreted as mental deficiency. He concluded, "The assessment you describe appears to have been conducted without proper clinical examination and without reference to the established distinction between neurological impairment and psychiatric incompetence. It is, in my professional opinion, wholly inadequate as a basis for legal action." Serafina read all 3 letters twice. Then she organized them with her other documentation and felt for the first time since finding the solicitor's letter, something approaching confidence. They arrived on a Friday. She watched from the upper window of the east wing as the carriages came through the gates. 2 of them, well-appointed and deliberate, moving up the drive with the particular quality of procession that suggested their occupants had rehearsed the significance of their arrival. She counted 4 figures descending. Gerald Whitmore, the elder cousin, perhaps 50, with the florid confidence of a man accustomed to his own authority. Thomas Whitmore, younger, less distinguished in bearing, offering the uncertain posture of someone fulfilling an obligation he did not entirely understand. Dr. Pemberton, returning with the weight of his completed assessment, and a 4th man whose leather case and precise suit identified him as the legal representative. She observed all of this with complete neutrality and a fury so thoroughly organized that it had ceased to resemble fury and had become instead something considerably more useful. The cold, focused energy of a woman who had spent 7 days preparing for precisely this moment and intended to waste none of it. She turned from the window and checked for the final time the documents arranged on the writing table before her. The physician's letters, the estate documentation, the legal counter-argument drafted with Mr. Fielding. Everything organized with the meticulous attention she applied to anything she considered worth the effort. She gathered the documents. She straightened her dress. She went downstairs. Lucian was in the entrance hall receiving his relatives with measured correctness. She read the particular quality of his stillness as she descended the stairs and understood that it was costing him more than usual. He looked up at her arrival and something in his expression adjusted. Not visibly, not in any way the assembled visitors would have identified, but she read it with the fluency of 6 months of close attention and understood it as steadiness recognized and returned. "Your Grace," he said, with the slight formality they still employed in company. "Your Grace," she replied, and came to stand beside him, with the calm, settled presence of a woman entirely at home in her own house. She turned to regard their visitors with an expression of courteous composure. Gerald Whitmore performed the introductions with brisk efficiency. The younger cousin Thomas offered a bow that managed to convey both social obligation and personal discomfort in equal measure. Dr. Pemberton met Serafina's gaze and looked away first. The legal representative of Mr. Thaddeus Crane looked at no one in particular and made notes. "We appreciate your receiving us," Gerald said with the tone of a man who had not genuinely considered the possibility of not being received. "It is not unexpected," Serafina said pleasantly. "Shall we go through to the drawing room? I have had refreshments arranged, and I believe we have a considerable amount to discuss." They went through. The Duke sat. The relatives arranged themselves with the slight awkwardness of people who had prepared for one kind of meeting and found themselves in another. Mr. Crane opened his leather case. Dr. Pemberton sat with the expression of a man whose professional confidence had been subjected to unforeseen erosion. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat and began. He spoke for some minutes. The argument was not without structure. The Duke's isolation from society, the reported episodes, the absence of reliable witness to his capacity, the responsibility of family to ensure the estate and title were properly maintained. He spoke with the authority of a man who had rehearsed and who had not anticipated interruption. Serafina did not interrupt. She sat with her documents in her lap and her hands folded over them and listened to the complete argument with attentive patience. When Gerald concluded with, "It is our firm belief that a formal assessment of competency is not only warranted but urgently required," she said, "Thank you. That is a thorough account of your position. May I offer a response?" Gerald blinked. He had not expected the response to come from her. "Naturally, Her Grace is welcome to—" "Oh, excellent," Serafina said and opened the first document. She began with the physicians. She introduced each letter by its author. She provided a brief account of his professional credentials and reputation. She had done her research on this as thoroughly as on everything else, and the credentials were considerable. Then she summarized each opinion in precise, unembellished terms. The condition described was neurological in nature. It did not affect cognitive function. It did not constitute by any reasonable clinical standard a basis for determination of mental incompetence. Dr. Harrington's language on this point had been particularly clear. She quoted the relevant passage with methodical economy. Then she turned to Dr. Pemberton. "Dr. Pemberton's assessment," she said with the same neutral pleasantness she had maintained throughout, "was conducted on the basis of social observation and second-hand account. He did not conduct a clinical examination. He did not consult the existing literature on neurological conditions, which, while limited, is not absent. He did not correspond with any specialist of relevant expertise before forming his conclusions." She looked at Dr. Pemberton with an expression of complete courtesy. "I believe Dr. Harrington's letter addresses the professional adequacy of that methodology in some detail. I would invite Mr. Crane to read the relevant section." Dr. Pemberton's complexion had achieved a quality of heightened color that she interpreted as professional discomfort rather than indignation. He did not dispute her characterization. He looked at his hands. Mr. Crane read the relevant section. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she noted the slight pause he took before continuing. The pause of a man revising his assessment of the proceedings. She moved to the estate documentation. She had organized this portion with particular care because it was in legal terms the most directly relevant. Mental incompetence as a basis for incapacitation required evidence of inability to manage one's affairs. She therefore presented 5 years of evidence of an estate managed with thoroughness and intelligence that she enumerated by category: the drainage investments and their returns, the resolution of tenant disputes, the legal correspondence, the capital expenditure records, the boundary dispute resolved with a legal argument whose quality Mr. Crane could assess directly from the documentation. She spoke for 40 minutes in total. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform indignation, though she felt it still cold and organized beneath every word. She presented her evidence with the neutral precision of a woman who had been underestimated comprehensively by nearly every person in her previous life, and had learned that underestimation was among the most reliable advantages available to someone who knew how to use it. Lucian said nothing throughout. He sat to her right and slightly behind her, at the precise angle from which she could not easily see his expression, and she was aware of his attention on her with the specific quality of attention she had learned to distinguish from all others. Absolute, unguarded, stripped of the deliberate management that he applied to everything he allowed the world to see. When she finished, the room was quiet. Gerald Whitmore had the appearance of a man whose prepared script had been removed some time ago, and who had been waiting for the opportunity to resume it without finding one. Thomas Whitmore was looking at the carpet. Mr. Crane was looking at the estate documentation with focused attention. Dr. Pemberton had not looked up from his hands for approximately 20 minutes. "I would suggest," Serafina said into the silence, "that Mr. Crane advise his clients on the legal merits of proceeding in light of the evidence presented. I am happy to allow some minutes for that consultation." Mr. Crane looked up. For the first time since the meeting had begun, he looked at her directly. His expression was not quite a smile, but existed in its vicinity. "I do not believe," he said precisely, "that a private consultation will materially alter the advice I am prepared to offer." He offered it. It was brief, professionally stated, and entirely conclusive. The evidence of competent estate management was extensive and well documented. The medical opinions of 3 specialists of established reputation directly contradicted the assessment on which the petition was founded. The petition, in his professional judgment, would not survive legal challenge, and he was not able in conscience to recommend its pursuit. Gerald Whitmore argued for 10 minutes out of what appeared to be constitutional stubbornness rather than genuine conviction. Thomas Whitmore did not argue at all. Dr. Pemberton conceded in the stiff language of professional retreat that the progressive opinions presented raised legitimate questions about the clinical basis of his assessment that he would wish to consider further. By noon, the carriages were being called. The relatives withdrew with the slightly diminished quality of people who had arrived expecting one outcome and were leaving with another. The sounds of their departure receded into the quiet of the house, and then the house was still. Serafina stood in the drawing room with her documents still in her hands and her fury finally beginning to release its long-held structure and become something softer and considerably more tired. She became aware that Lucian had not moved. He was standing near the window watching her with that expression she had first encountered in the library and now read without difficulty. The expression of a man being reached in a place he had not expected, stripped entirely of its usual deliberate distance. "You prepared all of that," he said, "in 7 days." "I found the letter on a Wednesday," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Serafina, you are not to thank me," she said immediately. "It was not done for gratitude. It was done because it required doing, and because I was the person best placed to do it, and because your affairs are my affairs. And I intend that to be genuinely true from this point forward, rather than theoretically true in legal documentation only." "I was not going to thank you," he said. Something in his voice had shifted. The evenness present but warmer, the control present but no longer defensive. "I was going to tell you that I have never in my life seen anything so precise or so formidable, and that watching you conduct those proceedings was among the most extraordinary experiences of my considerable experience." He paused. "And that I have run out of arguments for the position I have been maintaining for the past several months." "Good," Serafina said. "It was not a strong position." "No," he agreed, "it was not." She set the documents on the side table. The afternoon light was moving across the floor between them, long and golden, the particular quality of spring light that did not promise warmth but delivered it anyway. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the space between them had finally been reduced to its actual size, which was very small and had perhaps always been. That evening he found her in the garden. The same path where they had stood 2 weeks prior, though the evening now was warmer, and the grounds carried the smell of the season turning in earnest. She heard his steps and turned. He came to stand before her with the quality of a man who has prepared what he intends to say and is saying it without the protection of deliberate management. "I wish to ask you something," he said, "that I ought to have asked differently from the beginning." She waited. "I wish to begin our marriage honestly," he said, "not as an arrangement entered for practical purpose, not as a convenience constructed from mutual necessity, but as a genuine partnership between 2 people who have chosen each other freely, with full knowledge of the difficulties, and without the reservation I have maintained under the misapprehension that it protected you." He paused. "I cannot offer you a life without complication. I can offer you complete honesty, genuine equality, and the entirety of whatever I am without management and without concealment. Another pause, shorter. Will you have me freely and with clear eyes as your true husband, not by legal documentation but by genuine and mutual choice? Serafina looked at him in the evening light. This precise, controlled, profoundly intelligent, and profoundly lonely man who had chosen her because everyone else had found her too much and who had turned out to be in all the ways that mattered exactly enough. Yes, she said with the characteristic directness that had made her unmarriageable and had in the end made her exactly this. I will. Freely and with entirely clear eyes, she paused. And I would ask that you note for future reference that I have been waiting for some months for you to arrive at this question. I am aware, he said, that I have not been efficient. No, she agreed, but you have been honest. I find I prefer that. He stepped closer, not touching, not yet, but close enough that she could see the particular darkness of his eyes and the way the evening light caught in his hair and the precise moment when the composure that had characterized every interaction between them for 6 months finally entirely gave way. I love you, he said. I have loved you since February and possibly before. I love your intelligence and your refusal to be managed and the way you argue and the way you stood in that drawing room and dismantled an entire legal proceeding with nothing but logic and evidence and absolute conviction. He paused. And I find that I cannot maintain the distance any longer. I do not wish to maintain it. I wish instead to offer you everything, if you will have it. I will have it, Serafina said. All of it on one condition, which is that you understand I am offering you the same. Everything. Without reservation. Without the wall you have been maintaining to protect me from yourself. She stepped closer. Near enough now that the space between them was barely space at all. I love you, Lucian. I have loved you for months. And I am choosing this. Choosing you. With full knowledge of what that means. Not because I have no other options, but because you are the only option I want. The last of the distance dissolved. He reached for her and she stepped into his arms and they stood in the garden in the gathering darkness and held each other with the particular intensity of two people who have been alone for a very long time and have finally, against every expectation society had arranged for them, found their way to something that feels remarkably like home. When he kissed her, it was with the same directness he brought to everything else. No hesitation, no performance. Just the honest expression of something that had been building for months and had finally been permitted its full acknowledgement. She kissed him back with equal directness and felt the wall that had stood between them for 6 months collapse entirely and leave in its place something far more valuable. Trust, choice, the genuine partnership he had offered and she had accepted. When they finally drew apart, the evening had deepened to proper darkness. The windows of the manor glowed warm against the night. Somewhere in the distance, the first stars had begun their appearance. We should go inside, he said, though he made no move to release her. We should, she agreed, though she made no move to step away. They stood a moment longer, then he took her hand, and they walked together back toward the house, not as Duke and Duchess performing the roles society had assigned them, but as partners, equals. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed and had chosen freely and with clear eyes to build something neither of them had believed possible. They were married again that night, privately, in their own words, with no witnesses but the evening and the particular quality of understanding that exists between two people who have moved past pretense into truth. The vows were plain and undecorated and entirely true. And they were in the ways that actually constituted a marriage beginning. He led her to his chambers and closed the door behind them. The room was simpler than she expected. A large bed, a desk covered with books and correspondence, windows overlooking the gardens, the private space of a man who valued order and privacy in equal measure. He turned to face her. The composure was gone. In its place was something she had seen only in fragments, the full weight of his attention, his desire. His love offered without the protective distance he had maintained. I have imagined this, he said quietly, more times than I can count. Then perhaps, Serafina said, we should discover the reality together. What followed was the genuine meeting of two people who have chosen each other, who know each other, who have built over months of honest daily life a foundation strong enough to support this. The physical expression of something that had begun in the mind and heart and had finally been permitted its full realization. It was tender. It was passionate. It was honest. The same honesty they had brought to everything else. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, the comfortable silence of two people who have discovered that they are, in fact, exactly what the other needed. I did not know, he said quietly, that this was possible. Neither did I, she admitted. I want all of that, he said. I want precisely all of that. Nothing else would have been adequate. She smiled against his shoulder. You realize we are both extremely peculiar. I do, he said, and I find I prefer it. They were quiet for a while. Then she said, what happens now? Now, he said, we live together as partners, as equals. We manage the estate. We read and argue and solve problems. We build the life we have chosen rather than the one that was chosen for us. Without the distance, she agreed. Just truth. Just truth, he said, always. Outside the windows, the night deepened. The grounds of Blackthorn settled into quiet. And inside, two people who had been discarded by the world they were born into discovered that they had built in the space that discard had created something the world could never have imagined for them, something better, something true, something entirely their own. 1 year and 4 months after their wedding, Serafina Blackthorn stood at the window of the library and watched her husband cross the lawn with their daughter in his arms. Genevieve was 4 months old. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's tendency toward focused observation. At the moment she was conducting a serious examination of a leaf Lucian had plucked from the garden, holding it with the careful grip of someone who intended to understand it completely. Serafina smiled. Already the child displayed a remarkable capacity for concentration. The manor had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The gardens were better tended now. Not because the staff had increased, but because Lucian spent his mornings there when the weather permitted, often with Genevieve sleeping in a basket beside him while he worked. He had discovered, he told Serafina one evening, that physical labor helped manage the episodes, the rhythm of it, the predictability. She had added this observation to her documentation. The research she had begun 6 months into their marriage had evolved into something more substantial. She corresponded regularly with Dr. Ashworth and Dr. Harrington. They were compiling case studies, building a body of evidence about neurological conditions that the medical establishment had, until recently, dismissed as madness. It was slow work, but it was important work, and she found she had a facility for it. The drawing room door opened and Lucian entered with Genevieve. The child had fallen asleep against his shoulder, the leaf still clutched in one small fist. She fought valiantly, he said quietly, crossing to where Serafina stood. But the afternoon defeated her. Serafina reached out and touched her daughter's soft, dark hair. She has your stubbornness. And your intelligence, I suspect. She was attempting to eat the leaf with considerable determination. A scientist in the making. God help us. But his voice was warm, entirely warm. The careful distance that had characterized the first months of their marriage had dissolved so completely that Serafina sometimes forgot it had ever existed. He transferred Genevieve to her arms with the practiced ease of a man who had become, against all his expectations, genuinely competent with an infant. Serafina settled the child against her shoulder and felt the particular weight of contentment that had become familiar over the past year. This was what she had not known to expect. Not just partnership, though they were partners in every sense that mattered. Not just love, though she loved him with a depth that sometimes surprised her, but this specific domestic peace, the ordinary, extraordinary business of building a life together. The correspondence from Edinburgh arrived, Lucian said, gesturing to the desk. Doctor, Harrington wishes to know if you would be willing to present your findings at the Medical Society's autumn meeting. Serafina looked up. Present them myself. He believes your perspective as both researcher and observer would be invaluable, and that your legal background brings a clarity to the ethical questions that most physicians lack. They would permit a woman to address the society. Dr. Harrington suggests they can hardly refuse the Duchess of Blackthorn, particularly when she has compiled the most comprehensive documentation on the subject currently in existence. Serafina was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, I would need to prepare thoroughly. You always do. And it would require travel to Edinburgh. We could make it a family journey. Genevieve is portable. And I confess I would like to meet Dr. Harrington in person. His letters suggest a mind worth encountering. She looked at him. At this man who had married her as a practical solution to a social problem and had become by incremental degrees of daily honesty the central fact of her existence. You would come with me. Where else would I be? Such a simple question, such a complete answer. They stood together in the library as the afternoon light moved across the floor, and Genevieve slept between them, and the future they were building together extended forward in ways neither of them had imagined when they stood in the cold church 18 months ago. I have been thinking, Lucian said after a while, about your family. Serafina stiffened slightly. She had not seen her parents or her brother since the wedding. They had sent perfunctory congratulations when Genevieve was born, nothing more. What about them? Whether you wish them to know their granddaughter. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, do you wish them to know her? I wish you to have what you want. If you prefer the distance, we maintain it. If you wish to offer them an opportunity to know her, we extend it. But the decision is yours, not obligation, not duty, choice. She looked down at Genevieve. At this small, perfect person who had arrived with such determination 4 months ago and had in that brief time reorganized their entire existence around her needs. I think, she said slowly, that I would like her to know them. If they can be civil, if they can see her for herself rather than as some vindication of their management of me. And if they cannot, then we withdraw the opportunity. But I find I would like to offer it once. He nodded. Then we shall invite them. For a brief visit, with clear parameters. Clear parameters, she agreed, an immediate withdrawal if they prove incapable of meeting them. Naturally. This was what partnership meant, she had learned. Not the grand gestures, not the dramatic declarations, but this, the daily negotiation of how to build a life together, the mutual respect that allowed each person agency in decisions that affected them both. They had learned it slowly, through missteps and corrections, through the difficult conversation in the garden, when she had forced him to acknowledge that protection and management were not the same thing. Through the weeks after Genevieve's birth, when they had both been exhausted and uncertain and had discovered that uncertainty faced together was somehow more manageable than confidence faced alone. I should put her down, Serafina said. She'll wake irritable if she sleeps too long now. Shall I take her? No, stay, read. I'll return shortly. She carried Genevieve upstairs to the nursery. The room was bright and orderly, arranged with the same deliberate attention to detail that characterized the rest of the manor. She laid the child in her cradle and stood for a moment watching her sleep. So small, so entirely herself already. Serafina thought about the life Genevieve would have, growing up in this house, with parents who loved each other, who respected each other's minds. Who would teach her that intelligence was not something to hide, but something to cultivate? She would never know what it felt like to be told she was too much, too opinionated, too entirely herself. She would know instead that being entirely herself was precisely what she should be. Serafina returned to the library. Lucian was at his desk reviewing correspondence, but he looked up when she entered. Asleep. For now, though I suspect not for long. She is efficient in her rest, like her mother. Serafina crossed to the window and looked out at the gardens, at the life they had built here, at the manor that had seemed like a prison when she arrived and had become by slow degrees exactly where she belonged. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Regret what? This, us, the choice you made. He set down his pen and stood, crossed to where she stood, took her hand. Never, he said. Not once, not even in the difficult moments. You are the best decision I have ever made, and I make it again every morning when I wake beside you. She turned to face him fully, even knowing what it cost, the isolation we might have avoided if you had chosen differently. We are not isolated, he said. We have each other. We have Genevieve. We have work that matters and a partnership that functions and a life we have built according to our own design rather than society's expectations. He paused. And I would choose that over any amount of social acceptability. Every time, without hesitation. She believed him. She could see it in his eyes. The absolute certainty. I love you, she said. I find I need to say it, even though you know it. I do know it, he agreed, but I never tire of hearing it. I love you, she said again, for choosing me, for seeing me accurately, for building this with me. He kissed her, gently, with the familiarity of a year of nights together and the continuing discovery that familiarity did not diminish desire but deepened it. When they drew apart, he said, I have something for you. Oh, he crossed to his desk and retrieved a small leather journal. I have been keeping notes about the partnership model we have developed, the way we make decisions together, the framework we use. He handed it to her. I thought perhaps it might be useful for others who find themselves in arranged circumstances, a kind of manual for converting legal obligation into genuine alliance. She opened the journal. His handwriting filled the pages. Precise observations about their methods, the way they negotiated disagreement, the importance of explicit rather than assumed consent, the practice of regular reassessment of terms. This is remarkable, she said. It is incomplete. I thought perhaps we might finish it together. Your perspective would make it considerably more useful. A joint project. Everything we do is a joint project now. She smiled. Yes, it is. They worked until dinner, writing, revising, building a document that might someday help others find their way to what they had found. Not romance in the conventional sense, but something arguably more valuable. True partnership, built on honesty and respect in the deliberate daily choice to keep choosing each other. That evening, after Genevieve had been fed and settled for the night, they sat together in the library. The fire burned low. The house was quiet around them. Do you remember, Serafina said that first night when you told me the truth? I remember thinking you would leave, Lucian admitted, or that you would stay, but with resentment. I had not imagined you would stay and build this. I had not imagined there was anything to build, she said. I thought I was being delivered to an ending. Instead, I found a beginning. We both did. She looked at him, at the man who had been called mad by everyone who knew him and who had turned out to be the sanest person she had ever encountered, at the husband who had been chosen for her and who she now chose daily, at the father who held their daughter with such careful tenderness and read to her from philosophy texts because she should hear the ideas even if she cannot yet understand them. Tell me, she said, what you see when you think about the future. He was quiet for a moment, then, I see Genevieve growing, learning, asking impossible questions and demanding actual answers. I see us managing the estate together. Your research published. Perhaps more children if we are fortunate. I see us growing old together in this house, still arguing about Wollstonecraft and Mills, still discovering new ways to understand each other. He paused. I see partnership extending forward, all the way forward, until there is no forward left. Yes, she said softly. That is what I see as well. They sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the stars continued their ancient patterns. Inside, the fire burned down to embers. And two people who had been discarded by society sat together and contemplated the legacy they were building. Not wealth, though they had that. Not title, though they possessed it. But something rarer and more valuable. A model for what marriage could be when it was built on truth rather than convention. When two people chose each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When intelligence was valued as highly as affection and honesty as highly as harmony. They had been told, both of them, that they were impossible, too difficult, too much themselves. And they had discovered together that impossibility was simply the space where possibility had not yet been imagined. That the qualities that made them unmarriageable to everyone else made them exactly right for each other. That two people society had discarded could build in the space that discard created something society had never been wise enough to envision. A true partnership, a genuine alliance, a love based not on fantasy, but on the daily choice to see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. It was not the life Serafina had expected when she stood in the cold church 18 months ago. It was better, immeasurably, impossibly, entirely better. And as Lucian took her hand and they sat together, watching the fire burn down to ash, she understood that this was the only ending that mattered. Not dramatic, not performed, just true. Two people, one choice, remade daily, and a legacy extending forward into a future they would build together. Exactly as they always had, with clear eyes, with honest words, with the absolute certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they needed, and nothing less would ever have been enough.